Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream Vision by podcast. Today, I'm joined by Barrie Schwortz. He is a professional photographer and digital. He knows a lot about digital imaging, video recording, video editing, etc., etc. He's most well known for his work on the Shroud of Turin, and he's also co-authored a book with Ian Wilson, The Turin Shroud. I have a link to it in the description below. It's available on Amazon and other retailer websites and so on. He's been interviewed by numerous news outlets. He's been on the History Channel. He's been in a lot of places. He discussed the Shroud very much in the past. He still discusses it now all the time. In fact, we're talking about the Shroud today, obviously. And yeah, let's get started. So Barrie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Jacob.
Of course. So I just really want to start out with, at one point in your life, you were skeptical of the Shroud, as you've often said in prior interviews. But at some point, something convinced you that, actually, let me go take another look at the Shroud, and you became persuaded that it is authentic.
Well,
a brief summary of that journey.
Well, that's sort of correct. When I have to go back and give a little background here. I had a commercial photography studio, and one of the projects that I was contracted for was to do a research project with Los Alamos National Laboratories. And I did that project for 7 months. And at the end of that project, finished it, and I thought that was the end of it. The gentleman I worked with, a man named Don Devan, was an imaging scientist, and he was the lead on that project. Well, shortly after we finished that work, he called me again, and I thought, well, maybe it's another project. You know, when you're self-employed and the phone rings, you're always praying it's the next job. So he called me again, and I said, another project. And he said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I laughed, and I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed, and he said, so am I, remember? So he explained to me about a property that the Shroud image had, that they had been proposed for years and years and years. And for the first time in history, in I think it was February of 1976, they took an image of the Shroud and put it into something called a VP8 image analyzer, which just takes the lights and darks of the image and on a green screen monitor stretches them into vertical relief in a proportionate to each other. And the normal photograph would yield a jumbled mass and distorted mass. The Shroud image yields the natural relief of a human form. So that got my attention, because I knew I couldn't create that kind of depth information in a normal photograph of any kind, or typically in an artwork. So that got my curiosity up, and ultimately he asked me, he said they were going to form a team and they were going to need photographers. Would I be interested? My initial comment was no. But then I thought about it, and I thought about that image property, and I thought, maybe I should be a part of this. And I joined the team, but I was a skeptic, and because I had no emotional attachment to the subject matter. I certainly didn't have any, enthusiasm about doing it, other than I would have for any other imaging project, which my career was filled with. So I joined the team, but I was skeptical. And once we got to Turin and the Shroud was ultimately brought to us, I spent probably the first 10 or 15 minutes of that examination, which was 5 days and nights, 24 hours around the clock for 5 days and nights. So in that first 10 or 15 minutes, we photographers always carry around a high-powered magnifier in our pockets. I had my 10x loupe with me. And I immediately started looking at the Shroud, and especially in the image areas, just to see if I could see any paint or pigment or anything, binder, something applied there that would be visibly obvious to have created that image. And there wasn't anything. The fibers of the cloth were yellowed where the image is, but it was all the same color of yellow. And the only thing that made an image look darker in areas was a higher concentration of those fibers, more so in one area than in adjacent areas. So you can see what appeared to be darker. So within the first 15 or 20 minutes, I knew that there hadn't been anything applied to the shroud to create the image. And of course, over the next 5 days and nights and the next 3 years of evaluating all the data we collected, we pretty much proved that there is no paint, pigments, or anything applied to the cloth to have created that image. That it's a discoloration of just the top fibers on the surface of the cloth that are responsible for the image. So I was a skeptic, but I wasn't a total skeptic, because I knew early on, at least in my own mind and heart, that this wasn't a painting. This is not an artwork in the general sense of what we would consider an artwork, something created by the hand of a man. No way was it that. But there were still many questions that remain unanswered. And of course, I had the advantage of being involved with the science, so I had access to all the science, some of which was highly technical and published in highly regarded peer-reviewed journals. But the problem with that is the average person didn't even have access to peer-reviewed journals. This was 1978 through 1981, when the internet wasn't what we have today. So there was really no venue other than going to a research library to find these journals. The average person didn't have access to that. But there were still unanswered questions that I had. And I spent the next 17 years somewhat skeptical, but also convinced that there was something unique about this. Not necessarily, I don't mean miraculous, but just something that we hadn't yet learned or learned enough about to be able to fully understand. And it wasn't until 1995, when I was having a conversation with Dr. Alan Adler, who was the blood chemist on our team, who also happened to be one of the other Jewish guys on the team. And he gave me an explanation for one of my last sort of unanswered questions. And at that moment in time, that was sort of the last piece of the puzzle for me. Certainly, I trusted him. He was a blood chemist. He was world famous for that. And the question I had was about the blood. So at that moment in time, somewhere later part of 1995, I sort of became finally convinced that this had to be the real thing. So it wasn't just kind of an overnight changing of the mind. It was over 17 years before I finally became convinced, based on the scientific evidence, not based on any emotional response or theological points of view, but simply based on the physical evidence that we documented on that cloth, that this was definitely not some manufactured hoax or artwork, because here we live in the most image-oriented era of human history, and modern science has not been able to duplicate that image, even though many attempts have been made. You can make something that looks like the shroud, but you have to match the chemistry and physics that we've documented on that cloth before you tell me that this is how that image was formed. So as it stands today, even though our team went there with the sole purpose of determining how the image was formed, in the end, we could tell you what it's not. It's not a painting. It's not a scorch. It's not made photographically. But we don't seem to be able to know of a single mechanism that can create an image with the chemical and physical properties that were documented on the cloth. So it still remains a mystery from a scientific point of view. Of course, people of faith look at it as something that, maybe it was a product of the resurrection. And that's possible, I guess. That's not my field of expertise. But I will say this, that if somebody wants to believe that, that's not something science can address. I've often said that science is obligated to stay within the measurable and the observable, while faith has no boundaries. So people of faith can look at the shroud and accept it for what it is, but from a scientific point of view, it still remains a mystery. We have not answered the question yet. How is that image formed? And that was the prime purpose of our 5 days and nights in Turin, was to answer that question. And in the end, we really couldn't provide an answer for that question.
What do you think of critics that continue to insist that the blood was a painting, or perhaps someone else's blood thrown on there?
Well, here's the thing. The forensic pathologists who have studied the shroud, and there have been quite a number of medical doctors and forensic pathologists who have done intense studies on the shroud, they say that that blood is not applied after the fact. that blood came from direct physical contact with the body, and that it actually permeated through the cloth via capillarity, so that if you looked at the backside of the cloth, you'd see that blood stain on the reverse as well. It soaked through. It wasn't added afterwards. As a matter of fact, our team was able to demonstrate that in areas where there's blood, there's no image underneath, implying that the blood was on the cloth prior to the image being formed. So when people say that, it's because they've got an agenda. They have their own personal beliefs that they might want to support. I've dealt with and debated many skeptics. They don't really like to debate me because in the end, because I can quote the science and they're not that well versed in the science, in the end, they just sort of poo-poo the science of our team as, oh, I'm going to quote one of the skeptics saying that it's the rantings of believers. Well, I take exception to that. There were 3 Jewish guys on the team. There was a Mormon, there were some atheists, some agnostics, there were some Christians. Religion was never a part of what we were doing. And had it been, that formation of that team would have been completely different, because most of the members who were on that team were hardcore scientists from Los Alamos National Laboratories, from Sandia Laboratories, and even 2 members of our team, imaging guys from the Jet Propulsion Labs, one of whom was in charge of imaging on Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo projects. So they were not a bunch of wackos, a bunch of, what's the word somebody used, pseudoscientific nutters. Thank God that Los Alamos, which is a weapons laboratory, doesn't hire pseudoscientific nutters, or the world might have ended by now. These were hardcore scientists, and the sole purpose was just to determine how that image was formed. That was our purpose. And so emotionally, people look at this. It's very hard to study an object that has such a secondary emotional impact. Most archaeological specimens, nobody has an emotional feeling toward them. It's an object of study, and you study it, and that's pretty much the end of it. With the shroud, you've got this underlying religious aspect or theological aspect, which changes everything. I mean, this is an emotional thing for many people. And look, there may have been a few members of our team who had some emotional experience in being involved in the study of the shroud. It might have meant something more to them than it might have for the rest of us. But the data that we collected is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So you can look at the data and decide for yourself. That's why the materials are published and why they're all now readily available on shroud.com, which is our website. We just turned 27 years old. So when people make those claims, look, people don't like to change their belief systems. It's not an easy thing to do. And so it's much easier to challenge something than to accept it in this case. I understand that. It took me 17 years and I left my DNA on that cloth. So I can understand why people want to challenge it. But the peer-reviewed data, which is all published, doesn't support the claims made by the skeptics who ignore the peer-reviewed science or dismiss it as the rantings of believers. I'm quoting one of the skeptics specifically. So there's always going to be skeptics, and there'll be some people who will never be convinced no matter what science says, and that's fine. I don't care. I'm not keeping score, and it doesn't matter to me what people believe, but at least if somebody wants to have an opinion on the shroud, go to the real science that's based on direct physical examination of that cloth. Go to the science that documented what's on the cloth. And when people say, oh, well, you could have skewed the data. Look, the data is published. And if I have an instrument and I'm pointing it at a piece of cloth and I pull the trigger to take a reading with that instrument doesn't care if I'm a Jew or a Christian or a pagan. It doesn't matter. And it's the raw data that's been published that's where the evidence lies. And so the skeptics who just poo-poo that and dismiss it are virtually dismissing the evidence that supports the point of view that I have, which is this is most likely authentic.
And how would you address the claim that, that from some critics, like, okay, fine, it's an image of a guy that was crucified.
Yep.
It's his blood. But then they'll say, how do you know it's Jesus?
Oh, well, we can never scientifically prove that anyway. Nobody has the DNA of Jesus to compare. And DNA is not a valid test for the shroud because of all the contamination that's on it, including my own. And I'm a long-haired Jewish guy too. So DNA analysis isn't going to be good because that cloth is heavily contaminated. Back in 2002, they did a restoration of it. It was handled over 32 days by 2 Swiss experts, seamstresses, who removed the patches, scraped away the charred areas, steamed out some of the wrinkles, took off the backing sheet, put a new backing sheet on it, and they handled it for 32 days with no gloves, hairnet, or masks. So they left their DNA on every square inch of that cloth because they handled every square inch of it. Excuse me. And so I've often said that if we did a DNA analysis today, we'd find the man of the shroud is a Swiss woman because they were 2 Swiss women who handled it for 32 days. So all of that kind of data, you know, we hear about DNA solving the mystery overnight. Not necessarily the case with the shroud because of the level of contamination. It's been handled by literally hundreds, if not thousands of people over the centuries. And so some tests are just not viable. Interestingly enough, in spite of all the data that we have, we still don't have a viable explanation for a mechanism that can create an image and encode spatial data into the image density itself. Now, that's a little technical, I understand, but that just means that where the cloth came in direct contact with the body, the image is darkest. But there is imaging at a distance of 3.5 to 4 centimeters, and the image just fades, becomes gradually more faint as the distance increases until it reaches 3.5 to 4 centimeters where it reaches extinction. So some interaction between that cloth and the body, and personally, I'm thinking that maybe some form of chemical reaction might be a viable answer to that. Well, we don't have enough data yet to say that with any certainty. So look, we went there and did one set of tests. Nobody had ever done anything like it before. We had to kind of come up with everything on our own. We came back with massive amount of data, spent 3 years reducing it and publishing our work into peer-reviewed scientific journals. But there's so much data that it's an overwhelming amount of data. And we brought back not only the data trying to answer the one question, but we brought back 1,000 new questions. And our goal was to go back a second time, taking the data that we'd learned and what we'd learned from the initial tests, and go back and do a second series of tests. And it was approved by Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict eventually. He approved it. He sent it to Pope John Paul II. And then sadly, politics got involved and they wouldn't allow us a second go round. So we were never able to fully answer some of those questions that were raised by the data we did collect. So, you know, it's been 45 years and no one else has been granted access to the cloth, except of course for the radiocarbon dating in 1988. And that was a fiasco in its own right.
So why do you think that is? Why do you think they stopped letting other people have access to it? What's the deal?
Well, I mean, the radiocarbon dating didn't look too good. That was kind of a disappointment. Of course, I can't speak for the church, and it's the Pope who is now the legal owner of it, not the Catholic Church as an institution, but the Pope as a single individual is the legal owner of the shroud today. And my sources have told me, both in Rome and in Turin, that this Pope doesn't really want to mess with the shroud, and he has no intentions of allowing any further examinations on during his tenure. So everyone's hopeful that whoever his successor might be more willing and open to allow further testing. And, you know, the questions do remain unanswered. But I never answered your last question about why do we believe this is the historic Jesus of Nazareth. The only information we have about what was done to him comes from the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Taking that information, and at least the basic information, and using that basic information for our knowledge of the shroud, we know what was done to Jesus of Nazareth. He was scourged, and the man of the shroud has scourge wounds, not just on his back, the way artists have typically depicted it, but if I'm standing behind somebody with a whip and I get a little closer, just a little closer, those thongs are going to come around. They're going to hit the front of the body as well. No artist has ever shown that. But the man of the shroud has not only scourge wounds on his back, but on the front of his shoulders, his sides, and his legs, from the whip coming around and hitting the front of his body as well. So that's one thing. The blood stains are forensically accurate from direct contact with the body. Jesus was ultimately speared in the side and crucified, and we have a spear wound and crucifixion wounds in the hands and feet. And maybe the one thing that stands out from the rest is the fact that because he had proclaimed himself King of the Jews, he was crowned with a cap or crown or helmet of thorns, and there are blood stains on the man of the shroud's head that show the stains from a cap or a crown of thorns. Now, as far as we know, I qualify that, as far as we know, only one person suffered the scourging, the spearing, the abrasions on the shoulders from carrying the crossbeam, the patibulum of the cross. All those are on the shroud. And of course, we have the blood stains on the head from a cap or crown of thorns. So that pretty much points to Jesus of Nazareth. And these are accurate forensically to the man who was wrapped in that cloth. So the best plausible explanation based on those facts is that this is the cloth that wrapped the historic Jesus of Nazareth. I want to point out that accepting the historicity of Jesus and accepting that he was tortured the way it's recorded in the Gospels, we can accept all that without necessarily debating whether he was the prophesied Messiah or not. I believe he was a historic figure who lived. He might be the Messiah. Christians and Messianic Jews believe so. Others do not. So whether or not he was the prophesied Messiah, I believe he was a living historical figure, and I believe that this cloth wrapped his body.
So you're not necessarily saying that miracles or divine intervention was the result of the Shroud of Turin, because some critics of yours claim that you believe that about the Shroud.
Not at all. Look, my background is science, okay? And coming from a Jewish background, I don't have any of the same beliefs that necessarily a Christian might have. I don't believe that there's something miraculous about this, although many people do believe that, particularly people of faith. And, they're entitled to believe what they want to believe. But from a purely scientific point of view, we don't have any way of proclaiming that science is finished and that this must be a miracle. This cloth has had one in-depth scientific examination in its entire history, and that was 45 years ago. The technology has advanced so dramatically over the last 45 years that I don't believe we have enough data yet to exclude a natural explanation for the image on the shroud. And I do believe that the best possible answer is some form of chemical reaction occurring between that cloth and the body and the way the cloth had been manufactured and prepared. So I don't need a miracle to accept that we have an image that science still doesn't fully explain, although we've characterized the properties of the image. And those are the things that are documented in the scientific literature. So I don't adhere to the idea that this is a miracle. Although, on the other hand, if it was, in fact, the chemical thing that might have been some chemical thing that happened, it's pretty rare. So if you want to call it a miracle, you can call it a miracle. But from a scientific point of view, we just don't have the answers, but that doesn't prove it's a miracle.
And how would you respond to some claiming that they took a crucified man, they killed him, gave him the same injuries that the biblical Jesus suffered to make it look good, make it look like that was him in the shroud?
Show me the evidence to support that claim. There is none. That's just a hypothetical somebody came up with to explain away the shroud and call it a fake. But there's no evidence to support that.
I want to move on to another claim that some make, that the shroud doesn't fit how the Gospels claim Jesus was buried and wrapped before he was entombed. Entombed and buried, I meant to say.
Yeah, that's something I have discussed at times. I've had people tell me that it mentions in the Gospels that there were linen strips in the gospel in the tomb with the body, and so they said, well, if there's linen strips, that means he was wrapped like a mummy, not in a big sheet of cloth. Well, historic Jewish burials are. My father was buried in a shroud very similar to the one that we're talking about when he passed. So I don't agree with that conclusion that this doesn't match. As a matter of fact, when I first read that part of the Gospels, which of course New Testament, not my area, nor is the Old for that matter. When I first read that, I noticed that it mentioned that there was a second cloth, the face cloth that would have covered his face and head when they took him from the cross to the tomb, that was stained with his blood and pleural fluids from his lungs. And it mentions in the Gospels that that cloth was in the tomb, folded and separate from the main cloth, but in the tomb to be buried with the body. You know what that tells you? Authentic Jewish burial, because to this day, Orthodox Jews, when they pass, if their blood has been spilled and is on any kind of a cloth or clothing, that must be kept with the body and buried with the body. So when I read that in the New Testament, I said, well, if nothing else, he was given an authentic Jewish burial. Okay. And so anybody who says otherwise is wrong. I just disagree with them that this is very authentic. And look, biblical scholars, forensic pathologists, people who have studied this in depth over the last 40, 50, 100, even 100 years now, all of these issues have been addressed. So the skeptics keep bringing them up again, but in the literature, all of these things have both been discussed and those claims have been discarded. But of course, they're not going to acknowledge that, because then they would have to change their mind.
We have a super chat question from Brett Forza. Thank you for your super chat. Great guest today. Maybe Schwartz be with you.
Yeah, I get that a lot. I always tip my hat to Mel Brooks for thank him for that one.
I'd like to shift to many of the pictures that are shown in this book here, your book here, The Turin Shroud.
Right.
You have a bunch of pictures of crucifixion recreations, trying to compare the biblical crucifixion of Jesus to that of the shroud. Like one person just pretending he's being crucified, and they recreate images of what it would have looked like for Jesus to have been crucified, what the result would have been, and compare that with the shroud. And does it seem to match precisely the Gospels, what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it does. And look, there was a gentleman named Dr. Frederick Zugby. May he rest in peace. He died some years ago. He was the medical examiner, forensic pathologist, and medical doctor and anatomist. And he was medical examiner of Rockland County, New York for 35 years. He spent over 50 years of his life studying the effects of crucifixion, creating pseudo crucifixions where instead of a nail, he strapped somebody's hands to a cross and put on sensors on the body to measure the differences and what was going on in the body hanging from a cross like that. And I don't recall specifically which images you're referring to in the book, but we may have used some of Fred Zugby's experiments, because he did the most in-depth studies on this. And his results say that what's on the shroud is consistent with what his experiments have shown, and far more qualified than I am in those areas particularly.
So how long do you think Jesus, the image, the shroud, remained with Jesus' body before they took it out? Do you think it lasted? Do you think it was there for just as long as it typically is for other Jews that have been buried with the shroud before they took it out?
Yeah, I don't think we really know for certain, because we don't know exactly when the image might have formed. So you have to go back and look at what it states in the Gospels of how long he was in the tomb. It was Friday afternoon. The Sabbath was approaching. At sundown, they had to stop. They could not continue the preparation of the body. So they put him in the tomb, brought him to the tomb, began preparations, but had to stop. So that was Friday afternoon. And we know that Sunday morning, about 36 hours later, they came to the tomb and it was open and the body was gone. I don't debate where the body went. I don't know. Christians believe he was resurrected. Maybe he was. I don't know. For one thing, resurrection isn't a Christian term. It's right out of the Old Testament, so out of the prophecy. So, it was a Jewish concept to begin with anyway. So we just don't know. And because we don't understand the mechanism yet, we can't say, did this happen immediately upon him being wrapped in the cloth, or did it happen at the tail end of him being in the cloth? We don't know. So anybody who sort of pushes any particular point of view along those lines is speculating. And look, it's very easy to speculate, and we all do it. We're normal, we're human. But in the end, the data that's been collected, remember, the data we collected is prime sources. Those papers that were published are based on direct physical examination of the cloth and measurements taken specifically and directly from the cloth, including multiple kinds of photography and spectral analyses and chemical analyses and microchemical analyses and photomicroscopy and ultraviolet fluorescence photography and X-ray fluorescence imaging. We did all these tests because they were all appropriate for determining what constitutes the image and how might it have been formed. So our testing was all non-destructive, meaning we caused no harm to the cloth, but at the same time collected a massive amount of data. And it took us 3 years to go through it all after we came back and ultimately write our results from the various different experiments into scientific papers, submit those to journals, and have them published so that the information is now readily available to anyone. And all those papers now are on shroud.com, so you don't need to go to a research library to find them the way you did 30 years ago. Today, they're all in one place on shroud.com. And I always tell people, look, you don't have to take my word for anything. I don't have a horse in the race. So whether or not Jesus was resurrected isn't a question I can answer. That's for people to believe in their own hearts. That's up to them. That's not what we were there for. We weren't there to prove the resurrection or even prove it was Jesus for that matter. We were there to determine how an image got on a piece of cloth that has properties unlike any other image I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of them. So again, people with agendas are always going to point to their agenda as being the issue. And one of the nice things about being on that team was, and this was something I was uncomfortable with at the beginning, which is why I initially said no, this wasn't about religion or faith. This was about documenting what was on a sheet of cloth and trying to figure out what constitutes that image and how did it get there. And we weren't really able to answer that last part of that question. We can tell you what's on the cloth. We can tell you its characteristics. We can tell you that it's only on the top surface of the top fibrils, that it doesn't penetrate in the way an artwork paint. And look, we have blood stains and water stains on the shroud that penetrated through the cloth. You can see them on the reverse. If paints or pigment had been added, we would have seen it. Our photomicroscopy would have demonstrated that. And you can look at the photomicrographs made by Mark Evans of our team. There's no paint or pigment anywhere visible on any of the image areas that we looked at, which was all over that cloth.
What do you make of the claim that some critics make that the arms don't look realistic for a human body, the legs they don't look right if it's a crucifixion?
Well,
it's straight down, or some will say the legs shouldn't be propped up a little bit, but isn't that what happens in crucifixion?
One of the knees is bent. You can tell because if you look at if you look at the dorsal view of back of the man, you'll see that one of his feet is flat, and you can see his whole footprint, if you will, in blood. To get your foot to lay flat when you're laying on your back, you have to bend your knee. You have to. So one knee is slightly bent on the man of the shroud, enough so that his foot could be flat. Some people say he's in rigor mortis from being taken from the cross. I don't know if he is or not. I don't know that there's definitive evidence to support that or deny that claim, but that's been one of the claims made. But just because there's back, I think probably about 20 years ago, there was what's called an anthropometric study, where they took anthropology tables of various people from around the globe, and they compared that and did measurements of the man of the shroud, and they determined that this was a Semitic male. Now, that's far more detailed than I could go into here, and done by people far more expert in that area than me. And so my feeling is that people say, well, it doesn't look right, but that doesn't prove it's not right.
Why do you think some about 700 to 1,000 years ago, when the shroud was being discussed in the ancient world, medieval period, whatever, was like Pierre Darcy's, for example, the Bishop Pierre Darcy's. Oh, his letter written in 1389 is a confession that they faked the shroud.
There's no evidence that they claim he sent it to the Pope. Our friends in the Vatican have done a search in the Vatican secret archives. There's no evidence that that letter was ever received by or written or received or read by any Pope. Okay. The Darcy Memorandum is one of the 2 or 3 things that most skeptics like to bring up time and time again. It's been shot down so many times, and I don't want to spend a lot of time going into it. The Darcy Memorandum, if you look at what was going on in France at that moment in history, what happened was the de Charny family that had the shroud were displaying it, and they were obviously getting donations. So they were making some money on it. And they weren't kicking anything down to the local bishop. So the local bishop got upset. And, oh, I know the artist who did it. Well, you can't have an artwork without some artistic medium, and there's none on the shroud. So it's not an artwork. So that whole thing is typical. It's one of the 3 things the skeptics continuously bring up. And I imagine you might be going to ask me about Walter Macron any minute now.
So what do you think about the carbon dating that's been done on it? Do you think it was done properly? And what do you think of the results of it is basically what I'm asking you.
Well, I think there are now 5 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, 5 in highly credible peer-reviewed journals of equal quality and impact factor to the Nature article that made the claim the shroud was a fake, that show. Here's an example. For 27 years, any request to access the raw data, which most scientists will release after their paper's published, they release the raw data so other scientists can evaluate and perhaps even try and repeat the experiment, which is how science operates. Repeatability is part of the process. That repeatability, can be done by anybody. The point simply is, I've kind of lost my train of thought. Pardon me for that. It's been a long day already. Anyway, I just think that bringing up the Darcy Memorandum, bringing up the claims made by people who've never studied the shroud, who have not studied the science. Look, if you study the science based on direct physical examination, many of these proposed skeptical theories are shot down immediately. And yet guys like, well, I won't mention names, but certain skeptics continue to say, oh, well, it was made with a hot statue and scorched the image onto the cloth. But, one of our tests with ultraviolet fluorescence photography showed that all the documented scorches from the 1532 fire that are running down either side of the image, those scorches, when photographed with ultraviolet fluorescence photography, fluoresce in the red. Those are the results of a high temperature event that caused the burning and scorching in those areas. If the image had been produced by a high temperature event, when we photographed the image, we would have gotten some red fluorescence in the image. Not only did it not fluoresce, it even quenched the background fluorescence. The background of the cloth fluoresces a yellow-green. The image doesn't fluoresce at all, and it quenches the background fluorescence. So it's not the product of a high temperature event. So, many of these claims were made before we went to Turin, and some of our experiments were actually designed to answer some of those questions and to do the science necessary to come up with an answer. As far as the radiocarbon dating goes, look, they chose one sample site and took one little strip from one corner. I have spoken to countless scientists over the years since then. Every scientist I've spoken with asked me, even though I wasn't involved in the radiocarbon dating, why didn't they take more than one sample? Because you always need a control sample from someplace else on that cloth just to have something to compare to. They never did that. And it's turned out now that after 27 years, a French shroud researcher who's also a legal student went to England, went to the British Museum, which was the overseer of the three labs. They had all the collected data from all three labs held at the British Museum. For 27 years, nobody had access to it. This young man from France went to England, used the Freedom of Information Act, forced the British Museum to reveal and to release all that raw data. He then got several experts on his team to evaluate that raw data, and they came up with the conclusion that, number one, there's a gradient in the strip that they cut. That means they didn't get the same data at one end that they got at the other. So where on that cloth do you date it to tell me the relative date of anywhere else on that cloth? You can't. If that particular piece of strip of linen had been consistent from one end to the other, then the date they achieved would have been much more consistent, excuse me, and more credible for anywhere else on that cloth. But because they only chose one sample, there's nothing to compare it to. And so that rod, and the other thing they did was, you know, when you're doing tests, you might get one test that's completely off base from everything else that's consistent. It's called an outlier. So they would remove the outlier. And in evaluating the raw data, it turns out they removed an awful lot of the outliers, that there were many of them. And if they hadn't removed those outliers, they could never have claimed a 95% certainty for their results. So questionable. And then, you know, there's other issues surrounding the radiocarbon dating that are not so nice. For example, before the results were published in the Nature journal, the results were leaked. And upon that information coming out that, oh, we're going to prove the shrouds are fake, the Oxford lab received £1 million sterling, about $2.5 million in 1988. And Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum, who was the overseer of the three labs, resigned from the British Museum and went to the Oxford lab and took a permanent chair at Oxford with some of that money. So I hate to bring that up, but might that have had some influence on those results? I don't know. I just know that all of these things are questionable. And frankly, there's a book by Joseph Marino that is just a phenomenal detailed book, 800 plus pages, that documents every aspect of the radiocarbon dating of the shroud from before, during, and after the event. And each little bullet that he gives you with a fact, he gives you the reference for. So this isn't some hypothetical or some work of fiction. This is a thoroughly researched book on exactly what happened. And if you read that book, you'll feel the way most of us do now, that radiocarbon date just isn't valid. It's not valid because the sample they chose was not representative of anywhere else on that cloth.
You mentioned earlier that you expected me to bring up Walter Macron, I believe it was, but yeah, I'm bringing him up now. What do you make of his criticisms of the shroud?
Well, look, may Walter rest in peace. He's gone. I don't like to speak ill of the dead. When our team made the proposal, we put together, it's published on our website. You can actually read the proposal we gave to King Umberto, detailing what we wanted to do, that the king ultimately approved. Walter was not a member of our team, although he never clarified that when people mistakenly thought he was. He didn't say he wasn't, but he wasn't. Walter was so upset because he wasn't a member of our team that he ultimately went and developed his own protocols and submitted that to the king. And it was rejected in favor of ours, which was far more extensive and required a number of different disciplines to perform it. Walter was an expert with the microscope, but he wasn't a spectral expert, chemical analysis expert, UV or X-ray fluorescence expert. We had experts in all those fields because we wanted to do as comprehensive a study as we could. Walter had his own agenda. Walter was very upset that he was turned down and that ours was accepted. And I personally believe, and again, this is just my personal opinion now, that I think Walter was so upset by the fact that that occurred that I think he decided that whatever our team said, he was going to take the opposing point of view because he would stand out from the crowd. And so I think Walter had his agenda. Look, you know, like I said, I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but Walter definitely had motivation to push his agenda and to challenge. But here's the thing. Walter wrote quite a number of articles about the Shroud, but he published them in a journal called The Microscope, which he owned and edited. So that's not peer review. Our papers are published in Applied Optics or IEEE journals. Ask any scientist who works in those fields, and they'll tell you that getting your work into those publications meant you better have your act together. Walter published most of his stuff against the Shroud in his own journal. He had one that I'm aware of, paper published in a peer-reviewed journal on the Shroud, and all the rest of them were just in his own journal. So I don't give credence to Walter. And I think, look, do you think that 32 or 33 members of our team were all going to make it up and attack Walter Macron? No. Walter was free to do his own thing. He did have access to our tapes that Ray Rogers took after we came back. Ray Rogers delivered to him the sticky tape samples he had taken from the Shroud. It took over a year to get them back. Walter claimed they were his, and they were damaged. And so Rogers regretted his decision, but it was Ray Rogers who brought Walter on board as far as that goes. Now, when Walter was given those tape samples, he was also required to sign a non-disclosure agreement that he wouldn't release any data prematurely. We all signed a similar agreement, but it was a different agreement than the one that made us formal members of the STURP team. That we signed in September of 1978. Walter didn't get his materials until early 79. So he was never a formal member of our team, but he was an ancillary member in the fact that Rogers selected him to examine those tapes. But I don't believe that Walter's conclusions are valid because he doesn't have any supportive data other than with his own eyes. Well, you know, I remember I started this conversation by telling you that with my eyes, I looked at the Shroud and I didn't see any evidence of paint or pigment on that cloth. But that doesn't prove anything. What proves that there isn't paint or pigment is the spectral, chemical, and ultraviolet and X-ray fluorescence tests that we did that show that there's no paint or pigment on there, scientifically prove there's no paint or pigment there. That's called science.
Woohoo, thank you for your super chat. Why is he hiding his privates? He's dead.
That's not really a question that's easily answered. He's not hiding his privates, but the people who were preparing his body in the tomb might have placed his hands in that position. So perhaps, but again, that's not a question easily answered because there's no documentation of exactly what they did to him in the tomb before they had to leave because of the approaching Sabbath. So, but somebody also said to me, oh, if you lay on your back, there's no way your hands can cover your groin. Obviously, they didn't try because if you lay on your back and you try it, sure they can.
We got another one from Woohoo again. Thank you for your super chat. Why is the guy on the Shroud 65 years old?
Who says he's 65 years old? Who says that?
I've never heard of it before.
I've never heard that before. The estimated age is between 30 and 40. something like that. Remember, we're not looking at a photograph here. This is not a photograph of the man. This is an image caused by some interaction between the cloth and the body. So we can't tell his age, but I mentioned that anthropometric study that was done. And again, they said 30 to 40-year-old Semitic male. So that's a scientific study, not somebody's opinion based on looking at probably some internet photo of the shroud that's 5th or 6th or 10th generation from the original.
From what you've seen from your examination of the shroud, how old would you lean towards the person being?
Somewhere between 30 or 40 years old. Look, this guy was severely beaten. His cheekbones are swollen, one more so than the other. Put anybody through that kind of a torture, they're going to be haggard. He was probably in hypovolemic shock. He hadn't been given any water. They started beating him up the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm sure by the time they were done with him, he had internal hemorrhaging, had lost a lot of blood, perspiration, body fluids. So that leads to hypovolemic shock. So, it's difficult because we don't have documentation of everything that was done to him in the tomb. So it's very difficult for us to be able to make claims about how they did what they did. We just don't know in many of these cases. So this is like I said, this was for us going to examine the shroud was kind of like going to an unexplored part of the Amazon. There was no previously published data that we could use as a basis upon which to create our studies. We had to start from scratch. So people have said, well, you should have done this and you should have done that. Yeah, that's why we were hoping for a second go round, because many of the things that we came to realize that we could have done, we didn't realize until we came back with the data that we collected in that first go round. And those questions then arose. And so the idea would be to go back to answer those and perhaps other questions, but we were never given that opportunity. So that's why I say we don't have enough data yet to exclude a natural explanation, not in my opinion. And so, but many people of faith look at it as something from a religious theological point of view. That's fine. I mean, it's one of the issues with the shroud that's different than any other archaeological object. There's an emotional attachment to this object that no other archaeological find, I think, has ever had. So we have to deal with that emotional side as well. But from a purely scientific point of view, which is most of our team was involved from that standpoint. Were there some religious guys on their team? Yeah, there were a couple. But there were 33 of us. And if there are 3 or 4 religious guys, they can't change the data that's published, okay? The data is the data. And so I hate to sound like a broken record here, but the work we did was taken directly from that cloth. And there's nothing that's been published since that's more definitive than data taken directly from that cloth.
Brett Forsyth, thank you for your super chat. What do you make of the patina's signature found on the shroud matching Battalpiot tomb?
What signature? There are no writings on the shroud. That's, you know what Pareidolia is? That's, I think I see people have, if everything that people have believed to have seen on the shroud were truly there, Jesus would have to find a new cloth to live on. There wouldn't be room for him. That patina signature, there's no writing on the shroud, period. None. And any claims made to that are taken from poor quality photographs, manipulated photographs, contrast enhanced 4 or 5 generations later. You can find anything you're looking for in that. Look, human visual perception works a certain way that most people don't understand. When we're confronted with a random pattern, our brains, without any kind of conscious thinking of our own, they start looking for familiar shapes in that random pattern. And if you see a familiar shape that looks like a puppy dog, that's what you're going to see. That doesn't mean that's what's there. And one of the best examples of Pareidolia is the face of the man of the moon. Some people see a face there. Some people don't. Is there a face there? Well, not really. and that's called pareidolia. And it's just the way our human visual perception works. This is something most people don't understand. Seeing isn't necessarily believing, even though that's an expression. It isn't necessarily correct.
Yeah, I'd like to expand on what Brett's asking here for a moment. His question's related to a prior interview that I've done with Charles Pellegrino. He worked with Simca Jacobovici on the Talpiot tomb. He believes in the shroud's authenticity.
Yeah,
actually. But yeah, that's what Brett's basically asking here.
Yeah, and look, you know, they've never studied the shroud. Okay. They may have studied it peripherally, but they've never had the opportunity to physically examine and do testing directly on the cloth the way we did. There are no writings on the shroud. There are no secondary faces or figures on the shroud. One researcher found all the implements of the Passion on the shroud, spear tips, sponges, things that were mentioned in the Gospels. I don't see any of those. My dear friend, may he rest in peace, also from Israel, botanist Avinoam Danin, told me the last time I spoke with him in person, I was in Jerusalem, standing on the steps of the Notre Dame Center, and he told me that he had now documented 5,000 flower images on the shroud. How many do you see? And so people's visual perception gets in the way, and that's why you have to stay within the real realm of science. You have to be very careful, because our eyes are easily misled when people say, oh, no, I see it, so I believe it is. Why do you think optical illusions work? Because our brain can be fooled very easily. You got to understand how it works. What goes in the eye comes right out the back of the eye, through the optic nerve, straight to the brain before you, quote, see it, before you perceive it. And the brain has already processed that data before you perceive it. So it's very easy for us to misinterpret what we're seeing. And this is why we use science, and we're very careful before we make any dramatic claims about what we think we see on the shroud.
Let's get to the next question. Woohoo, thank you for your super chat. It's impossible to cover your grain if your arms are laying prone on the ground next to your body. Have Schwortz give it a try.
Well, I have given it a try, and apparently what this viewer is not understanding is, if you look at the man of the shroud, his head is slightly raised and tilted forward. Because if you look at any of the tombs, and I've been to the catacombs in Rome, they all have a little block of stone either carved in or sitting there, upon which the head is rested. Try it that way, my friend, and you'll see that you have no problem reaching the groin. I've tried.
Telenikon, thank you for your super chat. It looks like you forgot to put your question in the chat. I think you posted it here. There it is. He says, I'm absolutely intrigued by your work, sir. What were your typical camera and lens settings when shooting the shroud and shooting proximity?
Yeah, I can answer that. That's easy. So all of the documentation photographs of the team at work were done with two Nikons 35 millimeter film, both Ektachrome, Kodachrome, and black and white. I guess it was Ilford FP4 or FP2, something like, I don't remember exactly. So I had two Nikons. That's what I shot the team members with. However, photographing the shroud was a different story, and I used a 4x5-inch camera with 4x5-inch film. It was a Graflex camera with a Schneider lens, German lens, beautiful lens. I was probably 10 feet away from the cloth. There was nothing between me and the cloth but air. We were on a camera rail system, so I photographed half the shroud on one 4x5 sheet and shot a bunch of film of that. Then I slid the camera down the rail so the distance remained exactly the same. And I photographed the second half of the shroud on 4x5-inch film. And the life-size replicas that we offer now are made from those two 4x5 images, scanned on a cross-field drum scanner, put together in Photoshop to make it one 400 megabyte image. And that's what we make our replicas from. So I don't remember my exact exposure, but shooting on Ektachrome transparency film, balanced for tungsten lighting, for 3200 degree Kelvin lighting, our average exposure time was 10 seconds. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, he actually resent the same question over Super Chat, which is right here. So thanks again, Dylan. I can really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, and I still have all those cameras, although it's pretty hard to find film. Let me just throw in something that you might find a little bit humorous. I was lecturing to 10-year-old kids in Canada, and I was talking about film. And a 10-year-old kid put up his hand and said, "Mr. Schwortz, excuse me, you keep talking about film. Is that a USB device?" So a 10-year-old kid didn't even know what film was. So it's getting harder and harder to explain the shroud image that has the properties of a photographic negative when many people under, 35, 40 years of age today don't even know what a photographic negative is. So it's getting more difficult. But that technology was state of the art at that moment in time. And of course, it's been supplanted now by digital technology, which has now exceeded the resolution capabilities of the best films we had in 1978.
I wanted to get into one more thing here before we close, unless anyone else super chats questions between then. You mentioned the book that, as was physically demonstrated by Zugibe, had the woman been a crucifixion victim being nailed to the cross through the Z area, would actually have offered better support than in the case of distant space, it being capable of supporting hundreds of pounds without tearing.
Yeah.
How regarding a nail through this area? Like, what's that about?
Yeah, here's the thing. Look, throughout history, Christian artists have always depicted Jesus with a crucifixion nails directly in the center of the palm. That doesn't leave much room. And if you're a reasonably strong person and under that level of duress, it's possible that you might have been able to rip your hand loose. So the Romans, the poor Roman soldiers who had to do the deed of actually crucifying somebody, probably knew this little trick. Take the thumb and the little finger together. See the groove? That's called the thinner furrow. Now, if I wanted to nail somebody's hand to a cross, I could do that, put the nail right there, and look, it's about 1 inch down from the center of the palm. But the difference it makes is dramatic in how much it would take for a hand to be torn loose. And so that's what Zugibe said. I agree with him. I think that that's probably realistic, and we don't see the palm of the hands of the man of the shroud. We only see the exit wound on the backside of the hand. And if you were to put a nail here and look at the exit wound, you'd see that it comes out exactly where we see it on the shroud. So I think Zugibe was right. And look, he was a forensic pathologist, a medical doctor, and an expert in human anatomy. So I would defer to him on every occasion, just like he would have to defer to me on photographic or imaging issues. Those are my field of expertise.
Woohoo, thank you for a super chat. The head on the shroud is 30% longer than possible.
I don't know where you're getting this. Again, you must be looking at some really funky images of the shroud. Now, here's one of the problems we have with the shroud, and this is, I don't want to get too technical, but I have to tell you this. You'll notice the face looks quite narrow on the shroud. That might be why he thinks it's longer than possible, because it appears to be narrower. Well, if you look closely at the transmitted light images I made of the shroud, that's light passing through the cloth, you'll see that that cloth was woven from different batches of linen. Each batch probably produced a 1 inch or so wide band on the loom before they had to get the next batch, because they did it in small batches in ancient times. Each band of the shroud has slightly different properties because they were all bleached independent of each other with the sun, not with chemical bleaches, which didn't come along until late medieval times. So those bands, if you were to look at the shroud, especially at the face, you'll see there's like a straight, hard line down both sides, but more prominent even on one. And that the image is much more faint in those outer bands, and then the image comes back on the outer next band. No one has done an in-depth study of what differences there were between the various bands, which run the entire length of that cloth. And my transmitted light photos demonstrate that, prove that. And no one has done a study to determine why some bands took up the image darker than the adjacent bands when the distance was the same. So it's that narrowing of the face, because when you make that black and white high contrast image, you're causing what's in that fainter band to disappear into black. Makes the face look narrow and too long, but it's not. And the measurements done on research quality photographs of the shroud have proven that. So I suggest that viewer go back and read those papers that are readily available on shroud.com that talk about that and demonstrate that banding is an issue that has never been fully explored.
That same person has super chatted again. Thanks again. He says the back image is longer than the front image.
So it's a piece of cloth that can be stretched inches by just pulling on it, and it changes its dimensions as much as a centimeter just based on the relative humidity that it's in. This is not painted onto a piece of canvas or a piece of wood or something that's a stable background. This is a piece of woven cloth, and you can stretch it in any direction you want. So depending on which photographs you're looking at, that measurement is not a valid measurement based on the measurements that we've made. Got to be careful where you're getting your information from, folks.
I actually want to touch on one more thing before we close, because we're slightly over an hour now. I want to go back to the blood part. I know we covered that a bit earlier, but there are some people that go even further in the argument in criticizing the blood, and they'll say it's pig blood or animal blood, not even a human blood.
Well, where did they do their experiment? And let me see the results. Because all the results that we have from the blood that was taken from the shroud shows that it's probably human blood. The components of human blood were found in them. So, all these claims that are made, show me the evidence to support your point of view, because I can show you the evidence to support mine.
Well, thanks for coming on the show today, Barrie. Would you like to restate what you were saying earlier about where you would advise viewers to go get good information on the shroud?
Sure. Look, because I don't have an agenda, I publish skeptical information on data as well as non-skeptical, although there's lots more of the non-skeptical data. Shroud.com. On the 21st of January, our website celebrated its 27th anniversary on the internet. There aren't many people you can get on your show that can claim to have a 27-year-old website. Right. And people have made a big deal about our website being the #1 organic search result on Google. Until I have to point out that it's 2 years older than Google.
Wow.
We were online January of 96. Go back and look when Google came on the scene, was 1998. So, yeah, it's nice to be #1 search result because we're the oldest, largest, and most extensive resource of shroud information. So if you come to shroud.com, you'll see there's a search engine on the front page. That search engine only searches within shroud.com. It got so big I couldn't find stuff I knew I'd put somewhere. So I had to get a search engine to search within the site. But if you use that, you will find whatever you're looking for. There's about 175,000 words in the index to that search engine. So just about anything, if you know how to use a search engine, as most people nowadays do, you should be able to find whatever you're looking for. But all the peer-reviewed science, all of it, is either on the site or linked from the site, so you can get to it either on academia or in the journals themselves. Look at the real science. Look at the science based on direct physical examination of the cloth. Those are primary sources. Ask any scholar, whether it's in history, science, or any other field, the primary sources are where you always have to start because they're direct sources from the subject matter. All of this stuff that's come afterwards, all this speculation that it's this or it's that, that's pure speculation. And frankly, many of them are excuses made by people who don't want to accept the shroud could be possibly authentic. I don't care. It doesn't change my faith journey at all, one way or the other. So it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that if you're going to have an opinion about the Shroud of Turin, that you base that opinion on the facts that we have collected and not on the opinions of people who have no basis for their opinion other than their personal feelings. That ain't science.
Well, thanks for coming on once again, Barrie.
You got it, Jacob. Thank you for having me. And I hope I answered some of these questions. And look, I don't want to offend anybody, but there's science and then there's nonsense. And
right.
I hear the nonsense every day. You know, I'm a point guy now. I'm readily available. And so you wouldn't believe the stuff that I get in the mail. Not bad stuff, not bad. Nobody, no threats or anything like that. But just people telling me I'm an idiot and, I'm a fool and all this stuff. Well, remember, it took me 17 years after leaving my own DNA on that cloth before even I was convinced by the science, not by religious beliefs or anything else. The science convinced me. And people have said to me, well, why are you doing this? Because aren't you going against your own religion? I go, no, I'm not going against anybody's religion. Jesus was a Jew. Most of the disciples were Jews. Why shouldn't a Jewish guy be involved in the study of his cloth?
Well, thanks for coming on, Barrie.
You got it, Jacob. Thank you, my friend.
And I thank everybody else for super chatting their questions. I really appreciate it. They were great questions.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.